Shaq confronts officer beating black teen. The outcome is incredible. The afternoon air felt heavy, the heat clinging to the sidewalks and swirling with the sounds of the city. In a small, bustling corner of downtown, cars idled at red lights, pedestrians crossed intersections, and conversations buzzed through the humid air. For most, it was a regular day, but on one street, tension was beginning to build in the most unexpected way. A police officer in a stiff, navy uniform had stopped a teenage boy, a boy who couldn't have been older than 16. He was slight, wearing a faded denim jacket and scuffed sneakers, his shoulders pulled tight as though bracing for something unseen. His face, a mix of fear and defiance, seemed to flinch every time the officer's voice rose. "Put your hands against the wall," the officer barked, grabbing the boy roughly by the shoulder. "I didn't do anything," the boy protested, his voice cracking as he looked around desperately. "I swear, I didn't do anything wrong." Shaquille O'Neal happened to be nearby. Dressed in a simple white t-shirt and a dark blazer, Shaq's towering frame had just exited a nearby coffee shop. He'd been spending the afternoon meeting with a group of community leaders about youth sports programs when the commotion across the street caught his attention. Shaq paused mid-step, narrowing his eyes at the scene unfolding before him. He wasn't the only one watching. A small group of people, passers-by and shop patrons, had begun to gather at a cautious distance, murmuring in low voices. A woman whispered to her friend, "What's going on?" "That boy looks terrified." "I don't know," her friend replied, frowning. "But the officer doesn't need to be so rough." The officer yanked the boy's arm, pushing him harder toward the wall. "Did you not hear me? I said against the wall." The boy stumbled but caught himself, his breathing ragged. "I didn't do anything," he repeated, his voice softer now. His eyes darted around, locking briefly onto Shaq. It was as though he recognized him, if not his face, then his presence, and silently pleaded for someone to step in. Shaq shifted his weight, watching the scene unfold with growing unease. He wasn't one to jump to conclusions, but the kid wasn't resisting, at least not enough to warrant the aggression. Yet the officer seemed determined to escalate. "Stop fidgeting," the officer snapped, his hand moving to his utility belt as though warning the boy. "You're acting suspicious. What are you hiding?" "I'm not hiding anything," the boy said sharply, turning just enough to face the officer. His voice cracked with the mix of frustration and fear, his young face creasing with helplessness. The officer's patience snapped. He grabbed the boy by the arm, twisting it behind his back. The boy let out a pained yelp, stumbling forward, nearly collapsing under the officer's weight. Shaq frowned deeply now, his jaw tightening. A ripple of unease passed through the crowd as people murmured louder. Hey, that's too much," someone shouted. "Leave the kid alone," another voice added. But the officer barely seemed to hear them. "Keep your mouth shut," he growled at the boy. "This will go a lot easier for you if you stop running that mouth." The boy winced, blinking rapidly as though fighting back tears. "I'm not a criminal," he choked out. "I was just walking home." Shaq had seen enough. Though he wasn't ready to intervene fully, he didn't want to escalate things unnecessarily. He decided to step closer, his massive presence immediately drawing eyes from the crowd. His footsteps were heavy but deliberate, his broad shoulders cutting a path through the onlookers. The officer glanced up briefly, his grip on the boy not loosening. "Keep moving," he barked toward Shaq, clearly annoyed by the growing attention. Shaq didn't respond. Instead, he stopped just a few feet away, his gaze locking on the officers. The silence that followed was palpable, like the moment before a storm. Shaq didn't speak yet, but his calm stare was enough to communicate a warning. "I see you, and I'm watching." The officer hesitated, briefly shifting his weight as though reconsidering his actions. But then he turned his attention back to the boy. "Hands behind your back," he ordered, reaching for the handcuffs on his belt. The boy looked back at Shaq again, his eyes wide and desperate. "Please," he mouthed. "Help me." From the edge of the crowd, someone muttered, "Why is no one doing anything?" "Because no one wants to get involved," another voice replied. "You know how these things go." Shaq's fists clenched at his sides, his knuckles pale against his dark skin. He glanced around briefly, noting the unease in the crowd. It wasn't just that people were afraid to step in. They were afraid of what might happen if they did. Shaq understood that fear, but he couldn't ignore the knot forming in his gut. The boy's voice broke through Shaq's thoughts, sharp and pained. "I didn't do anything. Why won't you believe me?" The officer pulled the boy forward again, shaking him roughly. "I don't care what you did or didn't do. You look like trouble." Those words, "you look like trouble," cut through the air like a knife. Shaq's gaze darkened, and he took another step forward, his voice calm but unmistakably firm this time. "Is there a problem here?" Shaq asked. The officer turned sharply, clearly irritated now. "Mind your business," he snapped, glancing briefly at Shaq before doing a double take. Recognition flickered in his eyes, but it was quickly masked by defiance. "This doesn't concern you. It concerns me," Shaq replied, his voice steady. "If you're mistreating someone," the officer's jaw tightened, but he didn't let go of the boy. "This kid's a suspect," he said. "I'm doing my job. What's he being accused of?" Shaq pressed, his tone still calm but challenging. The crowd around them had grown quiet again, hanging on Shaq's words. The officer hesitated, clearly unprepared for someone like Shaq to question him. "That's not your concern," he said gruffly. Shaq tilted his head slightly, his expression unyielding. "It is now." The tension in the air thickened, as though the entire street had collectively held its breath. The officer stared at Shaq for a long moment, clearly debating his next move. The boy stood frozen, his gaze bouncing between Shaq and the officer, his breath coming in short, ragged bursts. In the background, someone whispered, "Is that Shaq? Like, the Shaq?" Another voice responded, "It is." He's stepping in, and while Shaq remained steady on the outside, he knew the situation was far from resolved. The officer was growing more defensive by the second, and the boy's safety was still in question. Whatever happened next, Shaq couldn't leave until it was done. The officer's hand lingered on the boy's arm, his grip firm, his expression unmoved. Shaq stood his ground just feet away, his imposing figure unshakable. The small crowd that had gathered was no longer just watching, they were recording. Smartphones emerged from pockets and bags, their lenses capturing every detail of the confrontation. Whispers traveled like wildfire among the onlookers. Is he really going to keep doing this with Shaq right there? Why doesn't he just back off? Everyone's watching. The officer glanced around at the growing audience, his discomfort evident. His face flushed slightly under the weight of the eyes now on him. But instead of loosening his hold, he doubled down, his voice louder and angrier, as if trying to reassert control. "I said move along," the officer barked at Shaq. "This is official police business. You don't belong here." Shaq's deep voice cut through the noise like a blade, calm but impossible to ignore. "I'm not leaving until I know this kid's okay." The officer's jaw tightened. He gestured with his free hand toward Shaq, his frustration bubbling over. "Do you want to be next? Back off, sir, or I'll..." "You'll what?" Shaq interrupted, his tone so low it sounded like a rumble of thunder. He tilted his head slightly, locking eyes with the officer. Shaq didn't need to raise his voice. His mere presence seemed to silence the street. "I'm just asking a question. Why are you roughing up this kid? What did he do?" The teenager flinched as the officer's grip tensed, his free hand hovering near the cuffs on his belt. "He was acting suspicious," the officer snapped, his voice strained. "He was loitering near that store back there. I have reason to believe he's been causing trouble." The boy's face was pale now, his voice trembling. "I was just waiting for my brother. I didn't even go in the store." Shaq's gaze moved to the boy, his eyes softening briefly. "Waiting for your brother?" he asked, his tone gentler. The boy nodded rapidly. "Yeah, he went inside to buy a drink, and I was just hanging out here. I wasn't doing anything wrong." The crowd murmured in agreement. A woman stepped forward cautiously, her arms crossed over her chest. "I saw him," she said. "He was standing there, not bothering anyone. You didn't need to grab him like that." The officer shot her a glare. "Ma'am, stay out of this." "I won't." she said defiantly, her voice shaking slightly. "This doesn't look right." More voices joined in. "Why don't you let him go?" "Yeah. This kid didn't do anything." The officer's shoulders stiffened, his posture becoming more rigid with every passing second. It was as if the growing crowd only fueled his frustration, his need to maintain control slipping through his fingers. His eyes darted back to Shaq, as though sizing him up, trying to gauge his next move. But Shaq didn't flinch. His calm, unblinking gaze bore into the officer, the tension between them thickening. "Look," the officer barked finally, his voice straining to sound authoritative. "You all need to clear the area. You're obstructing police work." Shaq didn't move an inch. "I don't think anyone here believes this is police work," he said, his voice still low, controlled. "We see what's happening." The officer bristled, his face reddening. "Are you accusing me of something?" he snapped. Shaq raised an eyebrow, his lips tightening. "I'm asking you to treat this kid like a human being." The officer's grip on the boy tightened again, and the teenager winced, letting out a small sound of pain. That was all it took for the crowd to erupt. "Hey, stop it. He's just a kid. Let him go. What's wrong with you?" The murmurs grew louder, angrier. Someone's voice rang out clearly from the back. "You know you're being recorded, right?" The officer shot a glare at the crowd. "Everyone, step back," he barked, his voice rising above the chaos. He fumbled for the radio clipped to his shoulder, clearly rattled. "I need backup, crowd control." Shaq stepped forward now, not aggressively, but with unmistakable purpose. The officer froze, his hand lingering near his radio. Shaq's voice remained calm, even, but the power behind it was undeniable. "This doesn't have to go any further," Shaq said. "Let the boy go." The crowd quieted, as though collectively holding its breath. The boy looked up at Shaq, his wide eyes filled with hope and disbelief, as though he couldn't quite process what was happening. The officer, meanwhile, stared at Shaq, his hands still hovering near the cuffs on his belt, clearly torn. He wanted to escalate, wanted to prove he was in control, but the presence of Shaq, combined with the mounting pressure of the crowd, made it harder to act. "Don't tell me how to do my job," the officer said, though his voice lacked the same edge it had earlier. Shaq didn't budge. "I'm asking you to do it fairly," he replied. "That's all." The teenager's breathing slowed slightly, his body relaxing just a fraction. The tension, however, was far from gone. The crowd watched in silence, phones still recording, waiting to see what the officer would do. The officer glanced around, his eyes flickering from Shaq to the boy to the growing line of smartphones capturing every angle. "You're all making this harder than it needs to be," the officer muttered. "This kid, he needs to come with me." "For what?" Shaq pressed, his deep voice deliberate. "What's the charge?" The officer opened his mouth, then closed it, clearly struggling to come up with an answer. A few more members of the crowd stepped forward now, emboldened by Shaq's presence. "You can't arrest him for standing around," someone said firmly. "Why don't you just let him go?" another added. The officer's face was a mix of anger and uncertainty, sweat beading along his brow as the crowd's pressure mounted. The boy stayed still, his gaze fixed on Shaq, as though Shaq's presence alone was holding him together. Shaq, for his part, remained where he was, unmoving, unshaken, as though he was prepared to stay there as long as it took. The tension continued to ripple through the air, growing heavier with each passing second. The officer's hand was still hovering near his cuffs, his face etched with frustration and confusion as the crowd pressed closer. Shaq remained still, a living wall of calm resolve, standing between the boy and an unnecessary escalation. The crowd's voices grew louder, emboldened by Shaq's presence. What had started as cautious murmurs had turned into open defiance. "Just let him go already. You're making this worse, officer." A woman in her late 40s stepped forward, her arms crossed tightly across her chest. "I saw everything," she said, her voice cutting through the noise. "That boy wasn't doing a single thing wrong. If you think anyone's going to let you get away with this, you're wrong." The officer's face reddened at her words, his authority slipping like sand through his fingers. He whipped around toward her, pointing an accusatory finger. "Step back, ma'am. Don't interfere with police business." "Police business?" the woman shot back. "I've seen enough to know what this really is." Shaq's eyes flicked to her briefly, silently appreciating her courage, before he turned his attention back to the officer. His voice was measured, but firm. "You're losing this crowd," he said quietly. "It's time to take a step back and think about what you're doing." The officer ignored him, his hand finally moving toward his cuffs as if to make an example of the boy. The teen flinched again, his breath hitching as he fought to hold back tears. "I didn't do anything," the boy choked out. "Why won't you believe me?" The officer's grip tightened on his arm, dragging him forward a step. "You don't talk back to me, kid." Before he could finish, a deep voice cut through the chaos, stopping him mid-sentence. "That's enough." Shaq stepped forward just slightly, his massive presence seeming to cast a shadow over the officer. He didn't raise his voice, but the authority in his tone was impossible to miss. The crowd fell silent, all eyes shifting between Shaq and the officer. The officer's mouth opened slightly, as if to respond, but he said nothing. Shaq's calm, unwavering stare seemed to pin him in place. For the first time, it was clear the officer wasn't just battling the crowd, he was battling himself. From somewhere in the crowd, a teenager holding his phone whispered, "He's about to back down, or he's about to do something stupid," another muttered nervously. The officer's shoulders squared as he seemed to gather himself, his frustration bubbling over. "I told you this isn't your business," he snapped at Shaq. "I don't care who you think you are. Back off." Shaq didn't move. "You don't need to handle him like this," he replied evenly. "He's just a kid." The boy's wide eyes darted between Shaq and the officer, the tiniest sliver of hope breaking through his fear. But the officer wasn't ready to concede. Instead, he seemed to double down, pulling the boy's arm harder as if trying to prove a point. The boy cried out, "You're hurting me. Stop it." Someone in the crowd shouted, "This isn't right." Another man stepped forward, his voice angry. "You're being recorded? Officer, do you even realize how this looks?" The crowd shifted, their energy turning restless. The situation felt like it was teetering on the edge of chaos, one wrong move away from completely unraveling. Shaq's expression hardened just slightly as he looked back at the boy. "Hey," Shaq said, his tone gentler now as he directed his words to the teenager. "You okay?" The boy swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper. "I just want to go home." Those words seemed to hang in the air, heavy and haunting, echoing far louder than they should have. The officer shot Shaq a glare, his chest rising and falling as though trying to regain control of the situation. "I've had enough of this," the officer growled finally, reaching for his radio. "Backup needs to get here now." Shaq's brow furrowed, and his jaw tightened as he exhaled slowly. "You don't need backup," he said calmly, though his tone carried a quiet edge of warning. "You need to stop. Right now." A new voice interrupted before the officer could respond. "Excuse me, officer. What seems to be the problem here?" The crowd shifted as a second officer approached from behind, his radio still crackling faintly with chatter. This one was older, more composed, with sharp eyes that quickly scanned the scene in front of him. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze locking on Shaq before flicking to the teenager and the first officer. The first officer straightened immediately, relief flashing across his face. "Finally," he said, jerking his thumb at the boy. "This kid's been loitering and causing trouble. He's resisting." The second officer held up a hand, cutting him off mid-sentence. "Slow down," he said coolly, his voice even but authoritative. "Resisting? What exactly did he do?" "He was standing near the store," the first officer insisted, acting suspicious. "When I approached him, he got mouthy." The second officer turned to look at the boy, who was visibly trembling now, his eyes darting nervously between the officers and Shaq. "Is that true, son?" he asked, his tone softer than the first officer's. "I didn't do anything," the boy whispered, his voice cracking. "I was waiting for my brother. That's all." Shaq spoke up again, his voice steady. "I've been here watching the whole thing," he said. "He wasn't resisting. He wasn't causing trouble. Your guy here decided to rough him up for nothing." The first officer bristled, his face flushing again. "This is none of your—" The second officer turned sharply toward him, his tone colder now. "That's enough." He looked at Shaq, nodding slightly as if to acknowledge his calm presence. Then he turned back to the boy. "Where's your brother now?" The boy hesitated, then pointed toward the store a block away. Inside, he murmured, "He's buying a drink." The second officer exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his jaw as he sized up the situation. The first officer looked ready to protest, his face twitching with indignation, but the second officer's presence seemed to quell him for now. Shaq didn't move, his massive form still looming protectively near the teenager. The crowd watched, their phones still recording, waiting for what would happen next. The second officer stood quietly, absorbing the tension in the air as though he'd stepped into the eye of a storm. His calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the first officer, whose jaw remained tight, his grip on the boy as rigid as ever. The crowd murmured restlessly, their voices a mixture of anger, disbelief, and concern. Shaq remained a pillar of quiet strength, his gaze steady and unflinching as he kept his position near the teenager. The second officer turned to the boy again. "You said your brother's inside the store?" The boy nodded nervously, his voice just above a whisper. "Yes, sir. And you've just been waiting here?" the officer clarified, his eyes softening just slightly as he assessed the teenager's posture. The boy looked more scared than guilty. "Yes," the boy repeated. "That's all. I wasn't bothering anyone." Shaq nodded to the second officer, his deep voice interjecting smoothly. "That's what everyone here saw." The crowd murmured in agreement. A man in his 30s, holding his phone high, called out, "He's telling the truth. This officer's been too rough with him from the start." A woman added, "You can see it on the video. It's all right here." The second officer turned to the first, his expression firm now. "Do you have any actual evidence of wrongdoing here?" The first officer shot Shaq a venomous glare before turning his frustration on his colleague. "I don't need evidence of anything," he snapped. The kid was loitering and refused to cooperate. "That's enough for me to bring him in." "Bring him in for what?" Shaq's voice cut through the noise like a blade. The first officer whipped his head back toward Shaq, his face turning a darker shade of red. "I told you to mind your business," he growled. "I don't care who you are." Shaq stepped forward slightly, just enough to make his presence even more undeniable, though he remained calm. "It's everyone's business when you're roughing up a kid for no reason. You're obstructing police work." The first officer snapped, his voice rising to the edge of control. His hand hovered over his radio again, his fingers twitching as if daring Shaq to push him further. Shaq didn't take the bait. "What work? He hasn't done anything wrong." The crowd's murmurs grew louder again, their discontent building. Someone near the back shouted, "He's harassing that kid, and we all know it." "Enough!" the first officer roared, finally losing the thin thread of composure he'd been clinging to. His face contorted with frustration, his voice booming as he tried to regain control. "Everyone, back up. You're interfering with police orders." But no one moved. The crowd stayed put, their defiance amplified by Shaq's quiet, steady presence. Their phones remained lifted, recording every second. The first officer's eyes darted nervously from the crowd to Shaq. His voice dropped to a gruff growl as he turned back to the second officer. "I don't need this. I'm bringing him in." "On what charge?" the second officer asked pointedly. "Suspicion," the first officer shot back, gripping the boy's arm more tightly. The teen flinched, biting his lower lip to stifle another pained sound. Shaq's voice came again, firm and deliberate. "Let him go." The words weren't a question, nor were they shouted, but they carried enough weight to stop everyone in their tracks. Even the first officer hesitated, his grip loosening at Shaq's command. For a moment, it seemed like common sense might finally break through. But then he stiffened, doubling down once more. "You don't get to tell me how to do my job," the first officer spat. Back off before I have you arrested for obstruction. The crowd gasped audibly at his threat, and the second officer's eyebrows shot up in surprise. For the first time, it seemed even he wasn't sure what to make of his colleague's escalating behavior. Shaq inhaled deeply through his nose, his massive chest rising and falling slowly. Though his expression remained calm, his eyes were sharper now, a warning. He looked the officer square in the face, speaking low but clear. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," the officer scoffed, trying to mask his unease. "Is that a threat?" "No," Shaq said, his voice calm as ever. "It's advice." The crowd erupted again, their voices clashing with the tension in the air. The first officer looked like he might explode, his grip on the boy shaking slightly as he fought to maintain control. "Listen to him," someone shouted. "This is going to blow up in your face, man," another voice added. The first officer turned sharply toward the second officer, his voice frantic now. "Are you going to help me or not?" The second officer hesitated, glancing back at Shaq before speaking. "You're escalating this," he said quietly. "Just let the kid go. There's no point in taking this any further." "Are you kidding me? You're taking his side." "I'm taking the side of common sense," the second officer replied flatly. The boy's breathing hitched again, his eyes darting between the officers, Shaq, and the crowd. His expression was a mix of hope and disbelief, like he couldn't quite believe someone might finally help him. The first officer's shoulders heaved as he turned back to Shaq, pointing an accusatory finger. "You're responsible for this mess. You think you can come here and play hero?" Shaq didn't blink. "If doing the right thing makes me a hero, I'll take it." The first officer's hand finally shot toward his radio, his voice barking into the mic. "I need immediate backup. Send units now." The crowd erupted into chaos. "What are you doing? Are you serious? He's really calling for backup?" Shaq didn't move. He stayed exactly where he was, his expression carved from stone. The second officer stepped back slightly, clearly trying to distance himself from the first officer's escalating meltdown. The teenager looked up at Shaq again, his voice trembling. "What's gonna happen now?" Shaq placed a massive hand on the boy's shoulder, his voice quiet but steady. "Don't worry, I'm not going anywhere." The officer's barked request for backup still echoed in the air, followed by the hiss of his radio. It was the tipping point. The crowd erupted into chaos, their collective frustration boiling over. "You're calling backup for a kid? Are you out of your mind?" A woman's voice rose above the others. "This is abuse. Everyone can see it," yelled a man holding his phone high. More people began stepping forward, phones trained on the first officer, their voices blending into a wave of anger and disbelief. Shaq, standing tall and unshaken in the chaos, locked his eyes on the officer as though silently daring him to continue. The officer's hand still clenched the boy's arm, but now, the teenager's face was streaked with tears he wasn't even trying to hide. He looked down at the pavement, his body visibly trembling, as though each second added a new weight he couldn't carry. Shaq's booming voice cut through the chaos, steady and unyielding. "Let him go. You're embarrassing yourself." The officer turned to Shaq with a snap of his neck, his eyes wild and his face redder than ever. "You think you're in charge here? I'm the law. Me, not you." Shaq took a slow step forward, looming even larger in the officer's line of sight. "You're supposed to protect people. You're failing right now." The crowd murmured its agreement, emboldened further by Shaq's calm but firm challenge. The second officer, still lingering a few steps away, watched the scene unfold with increasing unease. It was clear he wanted no part in his colleague's meltdown, but his silence only made the tension heavier. The first officer's voice rose to a near shout. "Step back, now, or I'll arrest you for obstruction." Shaq didn't flinch. He merely folded his arms across his broad chest, his expression as cold and unyielding as stone. "You're gonna arrest me? Go ahead. I'd love to see you try." The crowd gasped, falling silent for half a beat, the absurdity of the officer's threat settling in. A man near the front chuckled darkly. "Arrest Shaq? I'd pay to see that. Do you know who you're talking to?" Another voice chimed in. "You're out of your mind, man." The officer's breathing grew labored, his chest rising and falling like a man on the brink of panic. He glanced nervously at the second officer, then at the crowd, then back at Shaq, as though suddenly realizing just how deep he dug himself. This doesn't concern you," the officer stammered, though the fire in his voice was dying now. "You people don't get it." The crowd bristled at the word "you people," their anger palpable now. A man in a ball cap stepped forward, his voice dripping with disgust. "What do you mean, you people? Is that what this is about? You're harassing this kid because he's black, aren't you?" The crowd roared in agreement, their accusations ringing out like thunderclaps. "Racist," someone shouted. "You're a disgrace." The officer's face turned white as a sheet, the confidence and bravado draining from him like air escaping a balloon. His hand still hovered near the boy's arm, but it no longer held any power. It looked desperate now, pathetic even, as though he was clinging to the last shred of control he thought he had. Shaq's voice came again, deeper and slower this time. "I'm telling you one last time, let him go." The officer's hand trembled now, his resolve cracking under the weight of Shaq's gaze and the eyes of the crowd. He looked at the teenager, then back at Shaq, his fingers loosening slightly. But just when it seemed like reason might prevail, the sound of distant sirens cut through the tension like a knife. The officer's lips curled into a slight, twisted grin. "Backup's here." The crowd reacted immediately, voices rising in anger and disbelief. "You're seriously bringing in more cops for this? For this? You're just making it worse, man. You think backup will save you from this mess?" Everyone's filming. Shaq's jaw tightened as the sirens grew louder, but his eyes never wavered. "You're digging yourself into a hole you can't climb out of," he said simply, his tone heavy with warning. The second officer finally stepped forward now, his voice raised. "Enough. You're escalating for no reason. Let the kid go before this gets out of hand." "It's already out of hand," the first officer shot back, his voice bordering on hysteria. "None of these people are cooperating. This isn't how it's supposed to go." Shaq took another deliberate step forward, his voice as steady as ever. "You don't get to decide how this ends. The choice is yours. Do the right thing, or let this turn into something you can't undo." The officer hesitated, frozen in place. The teenager looked up at Shaq again, his tear-filled eyes wide with a mixture of awe and fear. For the first time, it seemed like he truly believed someone was fighting for him, someone who wouldn't let him down. The sirens grew deafening now as two patrol cars screeched to a stop on the edge of the scene. Their doors opened almost immediately, more officers stepping out. The crowd turned toward them, their voices rising once again. "Are you here for him? He's the problem. Why don't you arrest your own guy for this?" Shaq remained unmoved, his towering figure still shielding the boy like an unshakable wall. He kept his eyes on the first officer, watching as the man's composure crumbled further. "You still have time to fix this," Shaq said, his tone low but clear. "But you're running out of it." The first officer opened his mouth as though to respond, but no words came. His face twitched, his hand falling limply to his side. And for the briefest moment, silence settled over the street, an uneasy calm, like the pause before a storm. The moment the patrol cars skidded to a stop, all eyes turned toward the approaching officers. For uniformed cops emerged, their boots pounding against the asphalt as they advanced toward the chaos. Their radios crackled, the sound mingling with the anxious murmurs of the crowd. For a brief second, everything hung in the balance. The first officer straightened his posture, as if reinforcements signaled vindication. He gestured wildly at Shaq, the teenager, and the crowd. "Finally, about time you showed up. This mob's interfering with my work." The lead officer, a tall man with a hard-set jaw, paused to assess the scene. His sharp eyes darted from Shaq's towering form to the terrified teenager and the first officer's crimson face. "What's going on here?" he barked. The first officer wasted no time spinning his version of events. "This kid was loitering, suspicious behavior. He resisted me when I approached, and now this." He jabbed a finger toward Shaq, his voice dripping with disdain. This guy's obstructing police work, and the crowd is getting out of control. The lead officer's gaze flickered to Shaq, a flicker of recognition sparking in his eyes. He hesitated, clearly taking in Shaq's size and calm demeanor. "Is that true?" he asked flatly, his voice measured. Shaq finally spoke, his voice carrying like a wave that quieted the restless murmurs. "None of what he's saying happened," Shaq said, his tone deliberate but firm. "This kid wasn't doing anything wrong. He wasn't resisting. This officer decided to rough him up, and everyone here knows it." The crowd erupted with shouts of agreement, voices rising like a crescendo. "He's telling the truth. That officer grabbed the kid for nothing. It's all on video. Look." The lead officer's brows furrowed, clearly unsure who to believe. "Everyone, calm down," he barked, though his authority felt thinner now. He turned back to Shaq, narrowing his gaze. "Who are you exactly, and why are you involved?" At that moment, the first officer laughed bitterly, his voice thick with mockery. "Oh, he thinks he's someone special." He turned toward the crowd, spreading his arms in a theatrical show of exasperation. "What, you all think he's your savior or something? That was it." Shaq had enough. Slowly, he stepped forward, towering over the first officer by at least a foot. His imposing frame cast a shadow that seemed to swallow the officer whole. But it wasn't just Shaq's size that silenced the scene. It was the calm, simmering authority in his voice when he finally spoke. "Do you know who I am?" Shaq asked, his tone as smooth as it was deadly. The first officer faltered, his bravado cracking for the first time. "I what? I asked you," Shaq repeated, enunciating each word with precision. "Do you know who I am?" The lead officer's jaw visibly clenched as he turned toward his fellow officer. "You don't know who that is?" he asked, incredulity breaking through his previously stoic expression. The first officer blinked, a flash of doubt flickering in his eyes. "I don't. Why does it matter?" "It matters," Shaq said, stepping closer now, his voice like rolling thunder, "because you've been harassing a kid, roughing him up, and making a fool of yourself. Right in front of me. I'm Shaquille O'Neal." The crowd gasped collectively, a wave of energy pulsing through them. Phones shot up higher than before, people whispering excitedly as the realization dawned on them. "It's Shaq. That's Shaq. Oh my God. That officer's done for." The first officer froze, his face turning ashen. You're Shaquille O'Neal?" "That's right," Shaq replied. "And I've been standing here this entire time watching you abuse your power. You think you're untouchable? You're not." The lead officer stepped in quickly, sensing the shift in momentum. Wait, hold on a second." He turned toward the first officer, his voice sharp now. "Is this true? Have you been roughing this kid up without cause?" "I know. I was doing my job," the first officer stammered, his earlier confidence crumbling like dry paper. He was suspicious." Shaq cut him off, his deep voice leaving no room for argument. "Suspicious because of what? Because he's black? Because he was standing on a corner waiting for his brother? That's not suspicious. That's a kid minding his own business." The crowd roared their agreement, their anger renewed now that Shaq had said aloud what everyone had been thinking. The boy, still visibly shaken, looked up at Shaq with wide, grateful eyes. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice trembling. Shaq glanced down at him, his expression softening. "Don't thank me yet, kid." The lead officer turned to the second officer, his voice growing colder by the second. "Is there any merit to what's happening here? What did you see?" The second officer hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the spotlight. Finally, he sighed. "The kid wasn't doing anything. This officer escalated things for no reason." The first officer's face drained of color, his hands trembling slightly at his sides. "I know this isn't enough," the lead officer snapped, his voice booming. "You've disgraced this department today. You're done." The first officer's head snapped up, his mouth gaping. "What? You're done," the lead officer repeated firmly. "Badge and gun. Now." The crowd erupted into cheers, their voices swelling like a victory anthem. Phones recorded every second as the first officer stumbled backward, his eyes darting from Shaq to the teenager to the crowd. Humiliation flooded his features, his earlier bravado completely shattered. Shaq turned to the boy, his massive hand resting lightly on his shoulder. "You're safe now," he said, his tone kind. "You don't have to worry." The boy nodded, tears streaming down his cheeks now. Not from fear, but from overwhelming relief. "Thank you," he whispered again. Shaq looked out at the crowd, his calm presence holding their energy in check. "Everyone," he said, his voice carrying effortlessly over the noise, "let's make sure this doesn't happen again. Stay involved. Speak up. Don't let this kind of thing slide." The cheers grew louder, the energy of the moment almost electric. The first officer stood off to the side, his hands shaking as he unfastened his badge, his career collapsing before everyone's eyes. Shaq turned back to the teenager, his expression softening once again. "Where's your brother?" he asked gently. The boy smiled faintly through his tears. "He's probably still inside the store. I didn't think he'd take this long." Shaq chuckled softly, the tension finally breaking. "Go find him, kid. You're good now." The weight of silence fell over the crowd for a brief moment as the lead officer took the disgraced officer's badge and weapon. The metallic clink of the badge hitting the ground was sharp, final, and deafening. The crowd's collective breath seemed to pause as they registered what had just happened. The first officer, once brimming with bravado, now looked small, crumpled, and utterly lost. His mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. His career, the authority he had wielded so carelessly, was dissolving before his eyes. "You can't do this," the officer finally choked out, his voice barely audible above the murmurs of the crowd. "You're making a mistake." "I was doing my job." The lead officer's expression hardened. "Your job is to uphold the law, not to abuse your power. Look around." He gestured toward the phones still pointed like weapons in the crowd. "Everything you did is on video. Everything you said is recorded. There's no mistake here. You're finished, man." A voice from the crowd shouted, emboldened now that justice was being served. "This is what happens when you mess with the wrong people," another added. The boy, still clutching his arms nervously, looked up at Shaq, his face reflecting a mix of disbelief and relief. For the first time in what felt like hours, his shoulders eased, his posture softening as though a massive weight had been lifted. He looked at the officer who had harassed him, then back at Shaq. "Is it really over?" he whispered, his voice cracking. Shaq knelt down slightly, bringing himself to eye level with the boy. "Almost," he said gently, "but you don't have to be scared anymore. You're not alone." The crowd erupted into applause, cheers ringing through the air like an anthem of victory. Some people hugged each other, others whistled or chanted Shaq's name. The energy was infectious, a tidal wave of relief, validation, and triumph. The first officer stumbled backward, his face ghostly white, his eyes darting wildly between Shaq, the lead officer, and the crowd. He had no allies here, no support. The thin shield of his authority had been stripped bare, leaving only shame and the consequences of his actions. "You're making a mistake," he shouted at the lead officer again, his voice fraying with desperation. "You can't just take my badge. I was trying to control the situation." "The only thing you controlled was your own downfall," Shaq said, his voice calm but unrelenting. "You were given power to serve and protect, but you abused it. Now you have to live with that." The lead officer gestured toward one of the newly arrived patrol officers. "Escort him back to the station," he ordered. "We'll be filing an official report." The disgraced officer's eyes widened, panic setting in fully now. "No, wait. This isn't fair. You're going to ruin me over nothing." "It wasn't nothing," Shaq cut in firmly. "This kid's life isn't nothing. The people who trust you to do your job aren't nothing. You did this to yourself." The officer's shoulders sagged in defeat as the patrol officer gripped his arm and began leading him toward one of the patrol cars. The crowd cheered louder now, their phones following his every stumbling step. "Hope you learned your lesson," someone shouted. "About time people like you got what's coming to them," another chimed in. The boy watched, his wide eyes locked on the officer being led away. Shaq rested a hand on his shoulder again, a grounding gesture. "You good kid?" he asked softly. The teenager hesitated, blinking as though he still couldn't quite process everything. Finally, he nodded. "Yeah, I think so." "You don't have to think so," Shaq replied with a small smile. "You are." The second officer, who had remained quiet for much of the confrontation, stepped forward now. He looked at the lead officer, his posture hesitant. "What about the crowd? Should we let them be?" The lead officer interrupted, shaking his head. "They're not the problem here. If anything, they're the reason this didn't get worse." The second officer nodded solemnly before turning to Shaq. "I've got to say," he began, scratching the back of his head awkwardly, "you really handled yourself back there." Shaq offered a nod, his expression serious but calm. "Someone had to. You all need to do better." The second officer lowered his head slightly, shame flickering in his features. "You're right." The crowd's cheers were beginning to settle into a buzz of conversation now, though many still lingered, reluctant to leave. They wanted to hold on to this moment, a rare victory, proof that justice could win, even against those who abused their power. The teenager turned to Shaq, finally mustering the courage to speak more confidently. "You didn't have to help me," he said, "but you did. I don't know how to thank you." Shaq smiled warmly. "You don't have to thank me. Just promise me one thing." "What?" the boy asked. "Take care of yourself. And when you see someone else in trouble, stand up for them. Like everyone here stood up for you." The boy nodded, his eyes shining now, not with fear, but with something else. Hope. As the disgraced officer disappeared into the patrol car, the crowd began to disperse slowly, their voices still alive with excitement and satisfaction. People approached Shaq, shaking his hand or patting him on the shoulder as they left. "You're a hero, man. Thank you for stepping up. Not all heroes wear capes, huh?" Shaq smiled politely at each of them, but his focus remained on the boy. He could see the weight lifting from the teenager's small frame with every passing second. And he knew that, for the kid, this moment was bigger than anything the crowd could imagine. The street, which had been a battleground of tension just moments before, was now calm, alive with murmurs of admiration and relief. Shaq stood like an anchor in the middle of it all, the boy still by his side, and the patrol car with the disgraced officer disappearing down the street like the last remnant of a storm. People lingered, their phones lowered now as they exchanged words that carried weight. That officer finally got what he deserved. Did you see how Shaq stood up to him? Man's a giant. Literally, heroes aren't just in movies, huh? The teenager looked up at Shaq again, his small voice breaking through the chatter. You don't even know me. Why'd you help me like that?" Shaq crouched down, his massive frame still careful and gentle as he rested a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Because I've been you," he said quietly. The words hung in the air like a revelation. The boy blinked, confused. Shaq glanced at the gathering crowd, then back at the kid. "When I was your age, people looked at me like I was trouble too. Big kid, wrong place, wrong time, that's all they needed. But I had someone who believed in me, someone who stopped and stood up for me when I couldn't do it for myself. And that's what I did for you today." The boy's lips parted slightly, his eyes reflecting a mix of disbelief and gratitude. "But you're Shaq. Everyone knows you." Shaq smiled faintly, shaking his head. "Doesn't matter who I am now. What matters is who you become. Don't let today define you. You're not what they said you are." The boy nodded slowly, his trembling hands finally beginning to relax. He stood straighter, taller, carrying himself differently now, as though Shaq's words were something solid to stand on. The crowd began thinning further, but not before people approached Shaq one last time. "Thank you, Shaq. You don't know what this meant to all of us. That could have been my son, man." Shaq accepted their words graciously, his tone calm but firm when he replied, "It's all of our responsibility to stand up when something's wrong. Don't forget that." As the scene began to clear, Shaq walked the boy to the edge of the street, ensuring his brother was there to meet him. But for the people watching this story unfold, those holding phones, those yelling out for justice, and those quietly taking it all in, the moment didn't just end on that block. It was bigger than that. It was about what we do when we see something wrong. How many of us would have spoken up like Shaq did? How many of us would have hesitated, afraid of stepping into something uncomfortable, afraid of the consequences of challenging authority? And if we didn't speak up, what would have happened to that teenager? That's the question you have to ask yourself, because stories like this are not isolated events. Every day, people like this boy, kids who don't fit some arbitrary mold, kids who are judged before they open their mouths, are mistreated. And every day, people have the choice: stand up or look away. Now, not all of us can be Shaquille O'Neal. Not all of us have his towering presence or deep, booming voice. But here's the truth. You don't need to be a giant to make a difference. The real heroes are often the people who don't go viral. The woman recording on her phone, the man shouting, "This isn't right," the person who steps in to say, "Enough." Those are the people who change the story. Every voice matters. Every action counts. And for those watching this right now, you have that power. When you see someone being mistreated, when you witness an injustice, remember this moment. Remember Shaq. Remember the people who stood beside that teenager when he had no one else. And then ask yourself, what will you do? Because at the end of the day, injustice isn't just about what happens. It's about what we allow to keep happening. And change begins the moment someone steps up. It begins with you. Shaq turned one last time to the teenager, ruffling his curls gently. "You're gonna be all right, kid," he said softly. The boy nodded, a small, hesitant smile spreading across his face. As Shaq walked away, the boy watched him with wide eyes, the weight of the moment settling into his chest. It was something he'd remember forever, not just a story he'd tell one day, but a turning point. For Shaq, it was another day of doing what was right. For the boy, it was the day someone believed in him. And for everyone watching, it was the day they learned to believe in themselves, too.